When we hiked back down to the camp, Russell and I were relieved to see that the fire had been well kept by Donald. By the time we had returned, the cold had finally gotten to me and my bones chilled and my shoulders shivered. Russell himself was barely holding up, and together we carried and encouraged one another through the development of the snowstorm.
Alina,
Anna said. Russell fell to the ground as I removed my arms from holding him up. Russell and I had walked the rest of the way down the hill with our arms wrapped around each other. We weren't properly dressed for such extreme weather, and we knew that if we walked closely together, our body heat would support one another. My cheekbones and hands were numb, and my legs ached.
Donald, help me bring Russell by the fire,
Anna said. Donald and Anna lifted Russell and sat him in front of the fire while George went and got us some blankets. George walked over to me and handed me a long, thick blanket and wrapped a second one around Russell's shoulder.
What happened? Where did the trail leave? Did you find Alex?
George asked. Alex is dead.
What?
Alice blurted. We followed the trail to this burrow surrounded by smeared blood. We were nearly attacked ourselves by whatever killed Alex, I said.
It's true,
Russell said.
We hid away from the animal under a burrow. I'd say we were quite fortunate that it didn't find us.
What kind of animal was it? Did you get a good look at it?
Donald asked.
From what little we saw, it was unlike anything I'd ever tracked before. The damn thing was fast, too, knocking over trees from top to root.
Alina, is this what really happened? Or is this just a cold getting to Russell's head?
Of course I'm telling you what really happened, you stiff bastard. One of our friends has gone missing and is considered dead above all other things. Why in the hell would I fool around with that kind of talk, given our circumstance?
Russell's words didn't seem to sway Donald. He still wanted a straight answer from me. Yes, he's telling the truth. We both are, I said. The fire felt so nice as it warmed my bones. But at the same time, it almost felt too hot for some strange reason. It was terrifying to myself and the others, considering Russell didn't even know what this creature might have been, given that Russell was a hunter and a brainiac on wildlife and nature. A loud shriek from the creature echoed through the air, followed by a second roar that sounded very different in nature. We were all startled by the noises, both of which were familiar to my ears from earlier that day. Donald sighed.
All right, considering all that's happened, and all we can assume, I think it would be best if we just call this whole thing off and get back down the mountain.
Everyone packed their things while Russell and I got warm. Anna kindly offered to pack my things for me while George did the same for Russell. We strapped on our bags and lashed a rope onto each of us so that we could all walk closely to each other through the storm, thus to limit the likelihood of one of us straggling off and getting lost. We all wore thick coats and put on our waterproof ski pants. We all wore headlamps, goggles, and hiked with 2 walking sticks per person. Before we'd hiked more than halfway back the way we came, we started to see trails of smeared blood in the snow. A few feet further, we found limbs of several reindeer, torn apart, laying here and there to either side of us. The snow was soaked heavily with blood. Anna covered her mouth. She stood right in front of me. She reached back to grab my hand. I grabbed her hand back and massaged her shoulder to comfort her. A few moments later, Donald, leading the group, came to a complete stop.
Jesus, fuck!
I heard him gasp. I couldn't see what Donald saw. The snowstorm was too thick to see much of anything. But I could see a clouded formation of sticks in front of Donald. A while had gone by without a word from Donald as to why we had stopped. What is it? Nick, who was behind Donald, looked back and said,
Don't come up here. Russell, keep your eyes peeled.
No problem.
Russell mumbled.
The scenery looks fresh, which means whatever did this is still close by.
Alice panted heavily and started to cry.
Shut up, Russell! You're frightening me!
Alice blurted. No offense, Russell, but why don't you keep your hunting observations to yourself?
Yeah, well, if Alice doesn't keep her mouth shut, she'll be a lot more scared when that thing that killed Alex shows back up because of her wailing.
That just made Alice even more upset as she sniffed and moaned. She lifted her goggles and wiped away her tears. "You don't have to be so brutish, Russell," I said.
Unfortunately, I'm afraid I do. Because as far as I'm concerned, we haven't even recovered a mile of the hike back to the trail. And we appear to have found ourselves in this shit snowstorm, and only God knows what this creature is capable of. So forgive me if I help to inform Alice of how best to stay alive and keep her from drawing any unwanted attention to us all.
I ground my teeth and squinted at Russell while still hugging Alice. I looked back at Donald and Nick. I needed to know what was holding us up for so long. I unbuckled my lock on the rope and marched over to Donald. Nick saw me approaching and called for George to stop me. George unbuckled his lock on the rope and stood in front of me.
Alina, stop! Don't!
I punched George in the face as he got in my way and attempted to push me back harshly. I didn't mean to hurt George, but I desperately needed to see what Donald and Nick were debating about. Something became so determined and so easily annoyed with George's attempt to stop me. George rolled down the side of the path we were on and stopped near some trees. I continued walking, the specks of snow blowing past the thick fog slowly revealing to me. As I moved closer and closer, Alex. His body was butchered. His mouth was bloody, with several of his teeth knocked out. His arms and legs were strapped here and there, forming an X out of his body. His torso had been ripped apart and his intestines had been eaten, it seemed. His jaw was broken and dangled unnaturally wide. I can't believe it, I thought. The cold air helped to dampen the smell, but it was still very potent. Meanwhile, George was still further down the hill where my blow to his cheek had sent him. His body had plunged into the snow. He managed to pry his head out of the snow further down the slope. It was a lot thicker and harder to pry oneself out.
Help! Help! I can't get up!
Alice heard George's cries and unbuckled herself from the rope.
George, what's wrong?
I can't get out of the snow! I'm buried in too deep!
Alice looked over to Russell.
I'm going down after him.
Alice was still a little teary.
Alright, be careful. I'll be watching from here. If I see anything that looks like a threat, in the slightest, I'll yell and do my best to cover you two.
I myself started to get in an argument with Donald and Nick as to why they didn't inform the rest of us more abruptly about what was left of Alex. Why they had to debate about whether or not to show us what had become of him.
It wasn't a matter of showing you anything that concerned us. It was a matter of keeping you all quiet so that the two of us could plan out what we should do next.
Nick insisted. That conversation went on for a while, which kept us distracted from what was going on further down the hillside. Alice slid down to George and began digging him out of the snow, as Russell kept an eye open for threatening signs of the creature. The winds picked up and began to rock Alex and the structure he was on back and forth. The fog also became thicker, and every time Russell breathed in, his nostrils would coldly burn. Russell couldn't make out much of anything in the tree line close to Alice and George, so he took out some night vision binoculars he had packed with him and scanned the area through their lenses. Russell looked into the depths of the trees and saw not a creature, but a set of large eyes that glowed. Menacing eyes that had a certain familiarity about them. The eyes and whatever they belonged to couldn't have been more than 15 feet away from Alice and George.
Oh no,
Russell thought. Russell dropped his binoculars and cupped his mouth with his hands. He yelled down at Alice and George in the attempt to warn them. Alice was still working very hard to try and dig George out of the snow. George was still very deeply buried in the snow. Alice couldn't hear so much as a dim echo of Russell's yelling. Russell took up his gun and tried to aim it at the creature, but the fog was too thick to see anything at this point.
damn it!
Russell started to rush down towards Alice and George.